What happens when Britain's most beloved comedy legend walks onto a daytime talk show and drops a bombshell so controversial that it sends the entire studio into chaos? You won't believe what unfolds when Rowan Atkinson sits down with Ruth Langsford on Loose Women and delivers a statement so shocking that it triggers the most explosive confrontation in the show's history. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is television drama at its absolute peak, with tempers flaring, accusations flying, and one of the most dramatic exits ever captured on live television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of Loose Women turned into an absolute battleground when Ruth Langsford found herself face to face with a guest who refused to back down from his controversial views, leading to a confrontation that had viewers glued to their screens and social media exploding with reactions. The tension was palpable from the moment Rowan Atkinson walked onto the Loose Women set. Known worldwide for his iconic characters, Mr. Bean and Blackadder, Atkinson had been invited to discuss his latest creative projects and reflect on his decades-long career in entertainment. What should have been a light-hearted conversation about comedy and creativity quickly transformed into something far more sinister as underlying tensions began to surface between the legendary comedian and his host. Ruth Langsford, sitting confidently behind the panel desk, welcomed Atkinson with her trademark professional smile. But seasoned viewers could already detect something different in her demeanor. The usual warmth that characterized her interviews seemed forced, almost strained, as if she was preparing for battle rather than conducting a standard celebrity chat. Her co-hosts, sensing the unusual atmosphere, exchanged subtle glances while maintaining their on-camera composure. "Rowan, it's wonderful to have you here," Ruth began, her voice carrying an edge that suggested this interview might not follow the usual script. "You've been making people laugh for over 4 decades now. Tell us, what drives your comedy? What makes something funny in your eyes?" Atkinson, known for his measured responses and intellectual approach to humor, leaned back in his chair with a slight smirk that would soon prove prophetic. "Well, Ruth, I think comedy has always been about pushing boundaries, hasn't it? The best humor comes from saying things that perhaps shouldn't be said, from challenging the comfortable assumptions that society holds dear." The studio audience murmured approvingly, but Ruth's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Those who knew her well could see the warning signs. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her smile became more rigid. She pressed forward with her next question, unknowingly stepping into dangerous territory. "Speaking of boundaries," Ruth continued, "comedy has certainly evolved over the years. There's much more awareness now about what's appropriate, what might be harmful to certain communities. How do you navigate that landscape as a performer?" It was this question that lit the fuse. Atkinson's demeanor changed instantly, his casual posture straightening as his eyes narrowed with what could only be described as intellectual disdain. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees as he prepared to deliver what would become the most controversial statement of his career. "Navigate it?" Atkinson repeated, his voice taking on the sharp, cutting tone that his fans recognized from his more acerbic characters. "Ruth, I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding what comedy is supposed to do. We're not here to make everyone feel comfortable. We're not here to validate every sensitivity and wrap the world in cotton wool." The studio fell silent. Ruth's co-hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The audience, initially confused by the sudden shift in tone, began to realize that they were no longer watching a friendly celebrity interview, but the opening salvos of what would become an all-out war. "I'm sorry, but I think I need to challenge that," Ruth interjected, her professional mask beginning to slip. "Surely, as entertainers, we have a responsibility to our audiences. We have a duty not to perpetuate harmful stereotypes or make people feel excluded." Atkinson laughed, not the gentle chuckle of a genial guest, but a harsh, mocking sound that reverberated through the studio like a slap. "Responsibility? Duty? My dear Ruth, you sound like you're running a bloody Sunday school, not a television program. When did comedy become about making people feel safe? When did making people laugh become secondary to making them feel included?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Ruth's face flushed visibly, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of what felt like a direct personal attack. The other panelists looked on in horror, as their colleague was publicly dressed down by a guest who seemed to be enjoying every moment of her discomfort. "I hardly think wanting to be inclusive makes me sound like I'm running a Sunday school," Ruth shot back, her voice rising despite her attempts to maintain control. "What I'm talking about is basic human decency, Rowan, something that seems to be in short supply these days." But Atkinson wasn't finished. If anything, Ruth's pushback seemed to energize him, bringing out a side of his personality that the public rarely saw. Gone was the bumbling, endearing persona of his most famous characters. In its place sat a man who clearly relished intellectual combat and had no intention of backing down from a fight he believed he was winning. "Basic human decency," he repeated mockingly. "Is that what we're calling censorship now? Ruth, the problem with people like you is that you've confused being offended with being harmed. You've decided that protecting feelings is more important than protecting free expression. And frankly, that attitude is what's killing comedy in this country." The accusation hit Ruth like a physical blow. Her mouth fell open slightly, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely speechless. The audience, sensing the genuine animosity crackling between host and guest, began to murmur nervously among themselves. This was no longer entertainment. This was personal. Ruth quickly regrouped, but the damage was done. The mask of professional courtesy had been torn away, revealing the raw emotion beneath. When she spoke again, her voice carried a venom that matched Atkinson's own cutting tone. "People like me?" she repeated, her eyes flashing dangerously. "And what exactly do you mean by that, Rowan? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're making some rather sweeping assumptions about who I am and what I believe." The battle lines were now clearly drawn. What had started as a simple disagreement about comedy had evolved into something much more personal and much more dangerous. Atkinson, seemingly delighted by the turn of events, leaned forward like a predator closing in on wounded prey. "Oh, I think I know exactly who you are, Ruth," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're part of that generation of television personalities who think your job is to be moral arbiters rather than entertainers. You've appointed yourselves as the guardians of public sensitivity, deciding what the rest of us are allowed to find funny." The accusation was devastating in its precision. Ruth visibly recoiled as if she'd been struck, her face cycling through emotions, shock, anger, humiliation, in rapid succession. The studio had become completely silent except for the sound of cameras continuing to roll, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming television history. But Ruth Langsford hadn't built her career by backing down from confrontation. If Atkinson wanted a fight, she was more than prepared to give him one. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but filled with barely contained fury. "How dare you?" she said quietly, each word precisely enunciated and loaded with menace. "How dare you sit in my studio, on my show, and lecture me about what my job is supposed to be?" The gauntlet had been thrown down. The next phase of this confrontation promised to be even more explosive than what had already transpired, as two strong-willed personalities prepared for what could only end in complete victory for one and utter humiliation for the other. The studio atmosphere had transformed completely. What moments before had been a typical daytime television environment now felt like a gladiatorial arena, with Ruth and Rowan locked in mortal combat while their audience watched in stunned fascination. The other panelists had essentially become spectators at their own show, powerless to intervene in what had become a deeply personal battle of wills. Atkinson's eyes gleamed with what could only be described as malicious pleasure as he watched Ruth struggle to regain her composure. He had clearly struck a nerve with his assessment of modern television personalities, and like a skilled surgeon, he was now preparing to twist the knife deeper into the wound he had opened. "Your studio, your show," he repeated mockingly, savoring each word like fine wine. "And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, the ego that drives this entire charade. Ruth, you don't own comedy. You don't get to decide what's funny and what isn't, but you and your ilk have somehow convinced yourselves that you're the gatekeepers of acceptable thought." The venom in his voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't comedy or intellectual debate. This was pure, unadulterated contempt being broadcast to millions of viewers. Ruth's co-hosts exchanged horrified glances. realizing they were witnessing something that could end careers and destroy reputations. My ilk? Ruth's voice had risen to a level that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. You pompous, arrogant bastard. You sit there in your ivory tower, looking down on everyone else like we're somehow beneath you. But what you're really upset about is that the world has moved on from your outdated, privileged perspective. The explosion was magnificent in its fury. Ruth had finally abandoned all pretense of professional restraint, and her raw anger filled the studio like a physical force. But rather than being chastened by her outburst, Atkinson seemed genuinely delighted by the response he had provoked. Outdated? He laughed, slapping his knee theatrically. Privileged? Ruth, you're sitting on a daytime television show making judgments about what millions of people should find acceptable, and you have the nerve to talk to me about privilege? The irony is absolutely delicious. Don't you fucking lecture me about irony, Ruth screamed, her carefully constructed media persona now completely shattered. You've spent your entire career hiding behind characters because you haven't got the courage to show who you really are. Well, congratulations, Rowan. We're all getting to see the real you now, and it's absolutely pathetic. The audience gasped audibly at the profanity and personal nature of the attack. Several people in the front row looked genuinely shocked, while others pulled out their phones to capture what was clearly becoming legendary television. The cameramen, following their training, continued filming despite the chaos unfolding before them. But Atkinson wasn't finished. If anything, Ruth's personal attacks seemed to fuel his desire for destruction. When he spoke again, his voice carried a cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than his earlier mockery. Pathetic? He said quietly, leaning forward with predatory intensity. Ruth, let me tell you what's pathetic. What's pathetic is a middle-aged woman desperately trying to stay relevant by positioning herself as some kind of moral authority. What's pathetic is pretending that your opinion matters more than anyone else's, simply because you happen to have a television platform. The words hit Ruth like physical blows. Her face went white, then red, cycling through emotions so quickly that viewers could practically see her internal struggle playing out in real time. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a strangled whisper that the microphones barely picked up. You absolute shit, she breathed, her eyes filling with tears of rage and humiliation. How dare you make this personal? How dare you attack me personally when all I've done is try to have a civilized conversation about responsibility and entertainment? Civilized? Atkinson's laugh was harsh and unforgiving. Ruth, there's nothing civilized about what you represent. You and people like you are the death of genuine discourse in this country. You've created an environment where everyone has to walk on eggshells, where genuine humor is sacrificed on the altar of your wounded sensibilities. The attack continued relentlessly, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Ruth's co-hosts looked on in horror as their colleague was systematically dismantled on live television. One of them finally attempted to intervene, but Atkinson cut her off with a dismissive wave. No, he said firmly. Ruth wanted to have this conversation. Ruth wanted to challenge me about comedy and responsibility. Well, here's a lesson in both. Sometimes being responsible means being willing to say things that people don't want to hear. Ruth was visibly shaking now, her hands clenched into fists on the desk in front of her. When she spoke, her voice carried a desperation that made even seasoned television viewers uncomfortable to witness. This isn't about comedy anymore, is it, Rowan? She said, her voice cracking with emotion. This is about you showing everyone how clever you think you are. This is about you humiliating a woman on national television because it makes you feel superior. Oh, now we're playing the gender card, Atkinson exclaimed with theatrical delight. How predictable. When logic fails, when arguments collapse, out comes the victim mentality. Ruth, if you can't handle being challenged intellectually, perhaps you shouldn't be in the business of challenging others. The accusation was devastating in its surgical precision. Ruth recoiled, as if she had been physically struck, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly as she struggled to formulate a response. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the mechanical whirring of cameras and the barely audible murmurs of a deeply uncomfortable audience. But Ruth Langsford had not survived decades in television by allowing herself to be destroyed without fighting back. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a venom that matched Atkinson's own cruelty, and her words were chosen with the deliberate intent to inflict maximum damage. "You know what, Rowan?" she said, her voice steady despite the tears still visible in her eyes. "You're absolutely right about one thing. This isn't about comedy anymore. This is about the fact that you're a bitter, lonely man who's so disconnected from real human emotion that you mistake cruelty for cleverness and think that making people uncomfortable somehow makes you intellectually superior." The counterattack was brutal and personal, striking directly at what appeared to be Atkinson's core vulnerabilities. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across his features. But rather than backing down, he seemed to draw strength from Ruth's willingness to engage him on such a personal level. "Bitter and lonely?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Ruth, you're projecting your own insecurities onto me. The truth is, you can't stand the fact that someone is finally calling you out on your intellectual mediocrity and moral posturing." The battle had now descended into pure personal destruction, with both participants seemingly determined to inflict as much damage as possible on their opponent. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what was clearly becoming one of the most explosive confrontations in British television history. As the tension reached what seemed like an unbearable peak, with both Ruth and Rowan glaring at each other with undisguised hatred, it became clear that this confrontation was building towards something even more dramatic and devastating than what had already transpired. The silence that followed their last exchange was deafening. The studio audience barely dared to breathe, sensing they were witnessing the calm before an even more devastating storm. Ruth's co-hosts sat frozen, knowing that any attempted intervention would likely only escalate the situation further. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every nuance of what had become the most explosive confrontation in daytime television history. Atkinson broke the silence first, his voice carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more menacing than his earlier outbursts. "You know what your real problem is, Ruth. You represent everything that's wrong with modern broadcasting. You've turned television into a safe space for the perpetually offended, a place where genuine discourse goes to die." Ruth's response came like a verbal explosion, her voice rising to fill every corner of the studio. "And you represent everything that's wrong with entitled men who think their opinions are somehow more valid than everyone else's? You're a relic, Rowan. A dinosaur who can't accept that the world has moved beyond your narrow, privileged worldview." "Privileged?" Atkinson's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I'll tell you what privilege looks like, Ruth. Privilege is sitting behind that desk, claiming to speak for millions of people you've never met, while silencing voices that don't conform to your rigid ideology. You're not protecting anyone, you're controlling them." The accusation hit Ruth like a slap across the face. Her mouth fell open in shock and outrage, and when she found her voice again, it carried a fury that made her earlier outbursts seem mild by comparison. "Control? You arrogant piece of shit. I'm trying to create a world where people don't have to endure the kind of casual cruelty and bigotry that you apparently think passes for entertainment. But, clearly, that concept is too sophisticated for your prehistoric brain to comprehend." The profanity echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Several audience members audibly gasped, while others began reaching for their phones to capture what was clearly becoming legendary television. But Atkinson seemed energized rather than shocked by Ruth's language, as if her loss of control had proven his point exactly. "Bigotry?" he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Ruth, the only bigotry I see here is your complete intolerance for anyone who dares to disagree with your sanctimonious worldview. You've become exactly what you claim to oppose, an authoritarian dictating what others are allowed to think and say." Ruth was on her feet now, her chair pushed back so violently that it nearly toppled over. Her face was flushed red with rage, and her hands were shaking with barely contained fury. When she spoke, her voice was so loud that it distorted slightly through the microphone system. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on me, you condescending asshole. You came on this show with the sole intention of humiliating me, of proving how intellectually superior you think you are. Well, congratulations. You've shown everyone exactly what kind of person you really are." But Atkinson wasn't finished. Rising slowly from his own chair, he fixed Ruth with a stare that could have frozen water. When he spoke, his words were delivered with surgical precision, each syllable designed for maximum impact. "What I've shown, Ruth, is that underneath all your moral posturing and righteous indignation, you're nothing more than a hypocrite. You preach tolerance while being completely intolerant. You demand respect while showing none to others. You're a fraud, and frankly, everyone watching this knows it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ruth stood frozen for a moment, her face cycling through emotions so rapidly that viewers could see her struggling to process the magnitude of the insult. When she finally responded, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more venom than any of her previous outbursts. "Get out," she said quietly, her voice trembling with rage. "Get the fuck out of my studio. Now." Atkinson's smile was triumphant and cruel. Ah, there we have it. When confronted with an opposing viewpoint, when challenged intellectually, your response is to silence the opposition. Thank you, Ruth, for proving my point so beautifully. "I said get out," Ruth screamed, her voice breaking with the force of her fury. "Security! Get this piece of shit out of here before I do something I'll regret." The studio erupted into chaos. Security personnel began moving toward the stage area, while audience members stood and craned their necks to get a better view of the unprecedented drama unfolding before them. Ruth's co-hosts finally sprang into action, with one of them attempting to physically restrain Ruth, while another tried to signal the production crew to cut to commercial. But Atkinson wasn't quite finished with his destruction of the show's format and his host's dignity. Standing calmly amid the chaos, he delivered his final, devastating blow with the precision of a master executioner. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the cameras directly while ignoring the approaching security guards, "you've just witnessed the true face of modern television: authoritarian, intolerant, and completely unable to handle genuine intellectual challenge. When Ruth Langsford tells you what you should find funny, when she dictates what's acceptable discourse, remember this moment. Remember how she responds when someone dares to disagree with her." "Shut up, shut up!" Ruth was screaming now, completely out of control, her professional persona utterly destroyed. "You don't get to have the last word. This is my show." Atkinson's laugh was cold and final. "Your show? Ruth, after today, I doubt you'll have a show much longer. Thank you for the entertainment. It's been absolutely enlightening." With that, he shrugged off the security guards who had finally reached him, straightened his jacket with deliberate casualness, and began walking toward the studio exit. His movements were unhurried, almost casual, as if he was simply concluding a pleasant social visit rather than leaving behind the wreckage of what had been one of British television's most respected daytime programs. "Don't you fucking dare walk away from me!" Ruth shouted after him, her voice cracking with desperation and rage. "Don't you dare act like you've won something here!" But Atkinson didn't even turn around. He simply raised one hand in a dismissive wave, a gesture so perfectly calculated to inflame Ruth's fury that it seemed almost choreographed. As he reached the studio door, he paused for just a moment and called back over his shoulder. "Ruth, in comedy, timing is everything. And your time, my dear, is up." The studio door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the stunned silence that followed. Ruth stood frozen in the center of the stage, her chest heaving with exhaustion and rage, surrounded by the debris of her professional reputation and the shocked faces of her colleagues and audience. The cameras, still rolling despite the chaos, captured her final moments of complete breakdown as the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Her carefully constructed career, built over decades of professional broadcasting, had been demolished in less than 30 minutes by a guest who had systematically exposed every weakness in her armor. As production assistants scrambled to restore order and someone finally managed to cut the live feed, Ruth Langsford stood alone in the wreckage of what had been her domain, the echo of Rowan Atkinson's departing words hanging in the air like smoke from a battlefield. The most explosive confrontation in daytime television history was over, but its reverberations would be felt for years to come. The legend of the day Ruth Langsford met her match had been written in real time, broadcast live to millions of viewers who would never forget the moment when two titans of British entertainment destroyed each other on national television. And in the end, only one of them had walked away with their dignity intact.